A premier West Coast battle between the two best non-Power 6 programs in the country is set for late December between Gonzaga and San Diego State. We're going to break all things down about this rivalry coming up right after this.
You are Locked On Zags, your daily podcast on the Gonzaga Bulldogs. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.
What is going on, y'all? Welcome to the Locked On Zags podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. I'm your host and longtime Gonzaga podcaster, Andy Patton, here to bring you news and updates on all things Zag athletics. Happy Thursday, Zag Nation. Lots of stuff going on right now, even as we get into late July, early August, the supposed slow season for college basketball. We have a bunch of news coming out. Gonzaga and San Diego State starting a true home-and-home series beginning this year at the McCarthy Athletic Center. We're going to talk about that. We're going to talk about Gonzaga's non-conference schedule as a whole. 10 games are on the calendar now. We know who they're playing in Maui. What else is going to change on this calendar? How many more games are they going to add, et cetera, et cetera. We'll wrap up the show talking about home-and-home series in general, why it's good for college basketball, and then Friday's show all about conference realignment. We thought it was over. Colorado going to the Big 12, big storyline. We are going to get that covered, what it means for Gonzaga coming up on Friday's show. So stick with us for the rest of the week. For now, though, we got to start with the big story, a matchup that many have been clamoring for years, decades almost. It feels like Gonzaga, San Diego State. They've only played each other 4 times, despite being two of the best non-Power 6 basketball programs in the entire country. I was going to say on the West Coast, but they're the two premier ones. They really are. They have been for a long time. This has been a very fun matchup waiting to happen. And now we finally get an opportunity to see it come together for at least 2 consecutive matchups. Starting December 29th at the McCarthy Athletic Center will be one of Gonzaga's final non-conference games before they get into the WCC regular season. The 2024 game will be at Viejas Arena in San Diego. No date has been scheduled for that, but that will be how this home-and-home series will work. And now, as if Gonzaga needed to find a way to top what was already an incredible non-conference schedule last year when they played Alabama and Baylor and Texas and Purdue in the Phil Knight Invitational and Michigan State and so on and so on. Gonzaga decided to play the 2 teams that met each other in the national championship game last year. They said, we want both of them on the calendar, on the schedule. They'll play UConn in Seattle. They'll play San Diego State in Spokane. For so long, we talked about Gonzaga and their struggles to get these kind of opponents on the calendar. It's something we've seen Randy Bennett's team struggle with. It takes a long time to get to the point where you can put these kind of teams on your schedule. Look at what Gonzaga just did, though. The 2 teams that played for a national championship not only are both willing to play Gonzaga next year, but they're traveling to do so. UConn is coming across the country from Storrs, Connecticut to Seattle, Washington to play Gonzaga in what is going to be a neutral site, but it is on the West Coast. Of course, there is a return game at Madison Square Garden, so there is a benefit for UConn doing this, but for UConn to be willing to come across the country to play in what is going to be a road-adjacent environment to play a team like Gonzaga, while San Diego State is willing to come all the way to the Spokane, to the McCarthy Athletic Center. 2 teams that played in the national championship. This is proof of the growth. Yes, again, this is, it's not like it was Duke and Kansas in the national championship. That's a little bit different. UConn is a premier blue blood style program, but they are not quite at that caliber of program, and San Diego State is not in that conversation necessarily either. But still, for Gonzaga to bring both those programs to their home area is a testament to how hard Mark Few and their staff have worked to convince these teams that they are worth playing, that it is good for the sport, whatever other arguments they are able to use to get these teams to be willing to play. And this is going to be an extremely fun game. Both these games are going to be fantastic. For San Diego State, of course, there's kind of the built-in West Coast aspect of the rivalry. There's the fact that these two teams have had some pretty intense matchups in the past. San Diego State won the most recent game in this series. Like we said, it is 2-2 right now. San Diego State won at their home arena in 2017. They won in Spokane in 2010. That was the game that Stephen Gray dropped 35 for the Zags, but some at the time unknown forward for San Diego State named Kawhi Leonard helped lead the Aztecs to victory. Gonzaga won in 2016. Zach Collins had 15 and 8 in that one. So a lot of fun matchups we've seen between these two teams. I guess not a lot of fun matchups, but they have been fun matchups when these two teams have gotten a chance to play each other. And now they're going into next season. Both teams lost a lot of talent. San Diego State loses 3 of their starters. Matt Bradley runs out of college eligibility. Nathan Mensah is out of eligibility. Keshad Johnson transfers to Arizona to play with Tommy Lloyd next season. They still have Lamont Butler, who hit that game-winning shot over Florida Atlantic to send the Aztecs to that championship game against UConn. They still have Darion Trammell, the Seattle U transfer, who was a big part of their victory last year, and in fact got fouled by Ryan Nembhard and hit key free throws in that game to help San Diego State beat Creighton. So there's kind of a built-in matchup between Nembhard and Trammell already kind of there's already a bit of a history there, so that should make the game even more exciting. San Diego State does add some talent as well. They add a transfer from Campbell. They also add a transfer from USC, Reese Dixon Waters, who was the 6th man of the year in the Pac-12 last year and should be a big part of San Diego State's guard rotation, of course. Gonzaga loses a lot of talent from their team last year as well. No Drew Timme, no Julian Strother. But they do bring in a lot of key players, including Ryan Nembhard, who has that history against San Diego State. They bring in Graham Ike. Ike's played a lot against the Aztecs in his career from his time at Wyoming. He's faced them 4 times. Last time he faced them, he had a 10.10 rebound double-double. So there's some familiarity there. Not a lot of the same players at San Diego State after a year off, but still at least some familiarity on both sides for the coaching staff at San Diego State and for Ike himself. So that kind of adds a little bit of an element to this game as well. Going to be a really fun one. I'm really happy to see these teams finally meet. San Diego State's fan base is notorious, very, very well documented that they have come at Gonzaga a lot in the past. It's a fan base battle of sorts, and I think the kind of game that should have been being played for a long time as much as possible. I think seeing it going forward is going to be good for college basketball. It's good for West Coast college basketball in particular, and it's good for Gonzaga and San Diego State. And it is now the 10th non-conference opponent for Gonzaga this season. How might the final few games shake out? We're going to talk about that after a word from today's sponsor, LinkedIn Jobs. These days, every new potential hire can feel like a high-stakes wager for your small business. You want to be 100% certain that you can have access to the best qualified candidates available, and that's why you have to check out LinkedIn Jobs, because LinkedIn Jobs helps you find the right people for your team faster and for free. It's so easy to create a free job post, and then you just add your job and the purple hashtag hiring frame to your LinkedIn profile to spread the word that you're hiring. Simple tools like screening questions make it easy to focus on candidates with just the right skills and experience, so you can quickly prioritize who you'd like to interview and ultimately who you'd like to hire. And let's be honest, the right team member can have a positive and measurable impact on your business. That's why small businesses rate LinkedIn Jobs #1 in delivering quality hires versus leading competitors. LinkedIn Jobs helps you find the qualified candidates you want to talk to faster. Post your job for free at linkedin.com/lockedoncollege. That is linkedin.com/lockedoncollege to post your job for free. Terms and conditions apply. Folks, I want to thank all of you for making Locked On Zags your first listen or your first watch of the day. Shout out to those everyday listeners and everyday watchers on YouTube. Very much appreciate that. We're going to come back on Friday with conference realignment conversation. We talked earlier in the week, is conference realignment dead? Definitive answer, no, it is not. Colorado goes to the Big 12. As we're talking right now, it appears that is just a formality at this point. Assuming that comes together, what does it mean for Gonzaga? What does it mean for the Pac-12? What does it mean for the Big 12? What does it mean for UConn? All sorts of fun conversations to be had. We'll talk about that on Friday's show. Don't miss it. For now, though, we're going to continue our conversation about Gonzaga's non-conference schedule. We will worry about the conference stuff on a later date. because right now Gonzaga adds their 10th game to their non-conference slate. And looking at it right now, it looks like most of the big games have already been scheduled. I suspect there's maybe one more decent marquee style opponent that could get added to the schedule. I think the rest of the games that are going to get filled out are more likely to be those tune-up style games against opponents that were outside the top 250 in Ken Palm's rankings, teams that Gonzaga plays to just get a tune-up and get some of their younger guys some playing time or experiment with some lineups. So that's what I expect. We'll go through who is on the calendar right now already and what that's going to look like. We know that Gonzaga is going to play Kentucky at Rupp Arena, a true road environment for the Zags this year, even if Kentucky did not quite return the favor and they're on their side of the equation here. The date for this game is unknown. I'm suspecting it's going to be a relatively early game, although I don't know for sure. We just know that many of the games that do have schedules or that do have finalized dates for Gonzaga are later in the non-conference slate. Most of them are in December, which likely puts the Kentucky game in November. Kentucky's dealing with some injuries to some of their younger guys right now. Aaron Bradshaw's been out. Again, Onyenoso has been out as well. Unclear if those guys will be able to play for Kentucky by the time this game happens, because, of course, we don't know when the game is going to be. But they did land Trey Mitchell in the transfer portal out of West Virginia. Antonio Reeves comes back after scoring 14 a game for them last year. Still going to be a really solid team, even if they lost the big fish like Oscar Tshiebwe. I think it's going to be a fun game, and I think Kentucky at Rupp is never going to be an easy out. So that'll be a good one there. We got UConn. We talked about that already a little bit. Zags playing both of the teams in the national championship game from last year. UConn will be at Climate Pledge Arena in Seattle. Not in a finalized date yet for that either. And then, of course, the return game there will be at Madison Square Garden. UConn lost some talent from last year's team. No longer have Adama Sanogo, who's a big part of their team. Jordan Hawkins is gone, but they have Donovan Clingan, who's going to step into a huge role as their starting center. They add Cam Spencer. They land him as transfer out of Rutgers. He's going to be a big part. They have a top 10 or a freshman coming in who's expected to be a top 10 pick in the NBA draft in Stephon Castle. So it's going to be a solid squad for UConn and Danny Hurley again as well. Yale is the other game that we know of. We don't know a date yet. That game is going to be at the McCarthy Athletic Center. 21-win team last season in the Ivy League. This is the second time these two teams have ever played. I consider Yale in that kind of Kent State range of, it's not a tune-up game. It's going to be a legitimately tough opponent, but it's not a marquee, high major, blue blood caliber opponent either. It's just kind of a middle level opponent. I think Yale's a solid squad, and I'm happy Gonzaga's getting a chance to play them. We had the Maui Invitational. We talked about that in a recent episode. Now that we know that Gonzaga is going to be facing Purdue to start off the Maui Invitational, they get a rematch with Zach Edey, who did some serious work against them last year. Purdue returns basically their entire lineup. Mason Gillis is back. Braden Smith is back. Fletcher Lawyer is back. This is going to be a good Purdue team, of course, after losing in the first round of the NCAA tournament last year, second ever number 1 seed to lose to a 16 seed. There is a bit of a blueprint on how to beat Purdue. We saw some teams figure out how to do it. We'll see how Coach Matt Painter and that team adjust to those adjustments being made against them. What that means, Gonzaga doesn't have a ton of rim protection on the roster, an area of a bit of concern, at least on my end, in terms of how Gonzaga is going to compete with teams that have dominant low post scorers like Zach Edey. It is difficult for anybody to stop Zach Edey, but Gonzaga's roster is not particularly built well in that area. So we will see how they adjust to that and what they can do offensively to put Purdue on the ropes a little bit, scoring wise. In Maui, depending on whether Gonzaga wins or loses, and depending on what happens in the Tennessee-Syracuse game, Gonzaga will play one of those two teams, either Tennessee or Syracuse. Certainly Tennessee would be the more preferred opponent from a strength of schedule perspective. Tennessee's expected to be a top 15-ish team next season. Will probably be ranked somewhere similarly to Gonzaga by the time this game rolls around, depending on how they do in their early non-conference games. Rick Barnes has built a really good program at Tennessee. They returned a lot of talent. Josiah Jordan-James comes back. Zakai Ziegler comes back. This is going to be a really good team for Tennessee. Syracuse, of course, first year without Jim Boeheim. First time since Gerald Ford was president, which feels insane to say out loud, but is true that Syracuse will have somebody else manning the sidelines in Red Autry. Syracuse kept a lot of talent. They brought in some talent. I think this is a sneaky good Syracuse team. Of course, Gonzaga would prefer to play Tennessee for that second game because it likely means they beat Purdue, since we expect Tennessee to beat Syracuse. But if Gonzaga does end up playing Syracuse, it is still a quality opponent on their schedule at the very least, and a team that they have a lot of history with, which is always kind of fun to get those games going. We don't know who Gonzaga's third game is going to be against in Maui Invitational. Of course, depends on how everything shakes out. The other teams on the other side of the bracket, of which Gonzaga will play at least one of, would be Kansas, Marquette, UCLA, and of course the host squad, Chaminade. Hopefully Gonzaga will play somebody that's not Chaminade, but if they get Purdue and either Tennessee and Syracuse, and then one of those other two teams or three teams, a really, really good trio of games. This is a stacked Maui Invitational this year, as loaded as it's been pretty much ever. And I think it's going to be an incredibly fun tournament to watch this year down in Hawaii. Zags then got USC tentatively scheduled for December 2nd in Las Vegas. Sounds like they're still trying to figure out the actual venue, whether it's going to be at the MGM, whether it is going to be at the Mandalay Bay. The big excitement about this game was, of course, getting to see Bronny James. There is some question on how that is going to potentially work just because of Bronny's recent cardiac arrest. For those of you who did not hear about that, Bronny collapsed during a practice for USC, went into cardiac arrest, went to the hospital, is out of intensive care. That's kind of the latest update we have from the James family. This happened to a USC player last year, coincidentally, and that player did end up playing 14 games for USC last year, but wouldn't be surprised if this unfortunately prevents Bronny from getting a chance to play in that game December 2nd, which is a bummer because that was kind of a big part of the appeal for this game. But of course, the priority is Bronny James's health and safety. So if he's not able to go for that game, he's not able to go for that game. USC is still a really quality opponent. Boogie Ellis comes back after averaging about 18 points per game last year. They add Isaiah Collier, who's the number one ranked prospect in the class of 2023. So you got the number one high school player in the country, returning all Pac-12 player in Boogie Ellis. Still going to be a quality team, even if Bronny James is not able to go. Washington a week later, December 9th. That game is going to be in Seattle. The Zags play two games in Seattle this year, UConn and Washington. Finishes a four-year home and home series between these two schools. 13 of the last 14 have been won by the Zags. We know what Gonzaga has done in that UW rivalry. We'll see if they can continue that streak again this year. Mississippi Valley State 2 days later. That one is at home. This is the tune-up game that they have on the calendar so far. Mississippi Valley State, 5-27 last year, 4-14 in the SWAC. It's a tune-up game, just pure and simple tune-up game. The next game the Zags have scheduled is that game, of course, against San Diego State that we talked about, December 29th at the Kennel, likely the last game before we get into conference play. So 10 games for Gonzaga. They played 14 last year. Last year, by my count, they played 5 marquee opponents, 3 in the MTE, 2 decent opponents, and then 4 tune-up games. This year, I count 4 marquee games in UConn, Kentucky, USC, and San Diego State. 3 games in the MTE, as usual. 2 decent games, which I count as UW and Yale, and 1 tune-up game in Mississippi Valley State. That means if we were to replicate last year's schedule, Gonzaga would have 1 more marquee game and 3 more tune-up games to finalize their schedule. That feels about right to me. How quote-unquote marquee the last game Gonzaga adds remains to be seen. I'm not sure if we're going to get a really big premier non-conference opponent. Perhaps. I know Baylor is still working on their schedule. Perhaps they could get somebody like that. Maybe somebody in the Big East like Xavier. I don't think they'll get Marquette because they're in that in the Maui Invitational, tend to stay away from opponents like that. But perhaps they could even land a St. John's or Xavier or somebody like that. Arkansas. I'm wondering if they'll even try to go get BYU. You could make a debate that BYU is not a marquee opponent in the sense that they're going to be a lower ranked team per KenPom, but it would still be a big game for Gonzaga to add if they could find a way to make it work with Coach Pope. Tune-up games, there's a lot of different opponents that Gonzaga have played in these tune-up games in the past. I always advocate for Seattle U when I have these conversations because that's my other alma mater, and I think it would be fun for Gonzaga to get to play a team in the same state as them in Seattle U. Eastern Washington has been a historical opponent. I don't know if they'll play that game because of Steel Venters. Sometimes they stay away from playing opponents when they have recent transfers like that. Could open the door for somebody like Idaho, somebody like Montana could be in that conversation. Then there's some other connections that Gonzaga could pursue. They could try to coach against Valparaiso, where Roger Powell is the new head coach. I doubt they would do that, but it would be kind of fun. Gary Bell Jr. is the assistant coach at Northern Arizona. That would be kind of fun to get a chance to play Northern Arizona, a team that Gonzaga has played against in the past. There's, of course, a handful of other schools, some SWAC schools that Gonzaga has played historically, some even more local schools if they wanted to go the Big West route, play Santa Barbara or Long Beach or somebody like that. Tons of different options for Gonzaga to fill out the rest of their schedule. I think we probably have one more relatively exciting game that's going to get added to the schedule, and the rest are going to be just kind of those calendar fillers that Gonzaga's historically had to play in order to get their calendar secured. Well, the beauty of Gonzaga and San Diego State is that it is a true home and home series, something that college basketball desperately needs more of to keep this sport afloat. We're going to talk about that to close out the show right after this. All right, segment 3, still Andy Patton, still locked on Zags. Closing out today's show, continuing the scheduling conversation. We'll get into conference realignment in a major way on Friday's episode, but for now, we're still talking scheduling, and we're talking more broadly about the health of college basketball and specifically how home and home series can help that. Because Ken Pom proved in a recent research piece that he did along with Eamon Brennan, they wrote an article about it, that there are more neutral site games than ever before in college basketball. This is not a surprise to folks who've been following college basketball. I think anybody would have guessed that has been a trend that has been continuing over the last half decade or even full decade. We've seen more and more teams go away from playing those true home and home series and meeting at neutral sites. Not just Gonzaga, although we've talked about it a lot with Gonzaga with the Spokane Arena game at Kentucky. We've talked about it with them playing in Seattle with UConn and Alabama. And at least in those situations, the return game was also a neutral site game. Gonzaga played Alabama in Birmingham. Gonzaga is going to play UConn at the Madison Square Garden. But you're taking away some of the magic of college basketball. And we're starting to see some returns for that. Kansas and North Carolina agreed to a home and home series starting next season. That is huge. Kansas has never played in Chapel Hill. The first time these two teams met was in 1957. Wilt Chamberlain was playing for Kansas the first time these two teams met. And yet, as the two of the most premier recognizable college basketball brands in the United States, they have not ever played each other in Chapel Hill. They've played in Lawrence, Kansas once. That's it. These two teams have a rich history, 12 games between each other, 6-6. 7 of those 12 games have been in the NCAA tournament, which is not surprising as two premier college basketball brands. The most recent game was the 2022 National Championship, where Kansas came from 15 down, came back, beat North Carolina, and won a ship under Bill Self. But this kind of game is what college basketball needs. And I've been on this soapbox before on the podcast. I know you everyday listeners have heard me talk about this in the past, but I fundamentally believe that college basketball is first and foremost for college students, for the current college students, for the student athletes. That is who the sport is primarily for. You play for your college to represent your university and to represent your student population. I will forever feel more connected to the players who were at Gonzaga while I was there than other players. And that's not to say that you can only be the fan of a school if you went there. That is not what I am saying at all. I know there are many listeners of the show who did not go to Gonzaga, and I don't think that there's any delineation between an alumni or a non-alumni. But I do think that the connection you have when you are a student is stronger because you see them around campus. You see them in classes sometimes. Like You see them at parties. Like, you are connected to these athletes, and their victories feel more connected to you in that moment. But you have to be able to be there. And when you commodify college sports in such a way where you're prioritizing, we can make more money having this event at the Sanford Pentagon, who cares if no students are there or if very few alumni are there? Who cares? It's still going to be a crowd. It's still going to be money. The school is still going to take a profit out of it. And like, I use the Sanford Pentagon as an example. And like, there was an NIL situation involved with that game, and Peacock and the players made a good chunk of change out of that. And I think that's great. I don't want to imply that Gonzaga playing Baylor at the Sanford Pentagon in a vacuum is bad for college basketball, because that's not necessarily what I mean. I think occasional one-off games are not bad, but the continued removal of home and home series in favor of neutral site versus neutral site, in favor of finding bigger arenas or more elaborate places to play, the gimmicky ones, is kind of a different conversation. The games on aircrafts and whatnot, like, I understand that that's a little bit different, and that's a different conversation, which we won't fully go down right now. But at the end of the day, I think that college basketball is at its best when you're watching the team playing at their home arena, when you see the traditions that fan bases have, not just Zombie Nation for Gonzaga, but every school has their traditions, all of them. The mid-major schools, the high-major schools, we know more about what the Cameron Crazies do. We know more about the Rock Chalk Jayhawk chant at Kansas because they're more iconic, they're more recognizable. But even at other schools, they have their traditions. They have things that they do. And you don't get to experience those when they're playing in regular NBA arenas, playing on football fields sometimes. So for me, I want to continue to see more true home and home series. Gonzaga has attempted to do these. Kentucky is going to eventually play them at the Kennel, so that is a win. We'll say that. UConn and Bama, they had the Seattle series. At least the return game wasn't at home, so I think that's okay. But when you think about like college football, like one of the things that makes college football so successful is these huge booming arenas, and they have they have the traditions. Wisconsin has jump around at the start of the fourth quarter. Like UW has Purple Haze playing at the beginning of the game. Like Oregon has shout. Like there's these routines and these traditions. And like, that's what you watch the game for, is to see like, the pouring rain at a game at Husky Stadium and everybody just going nuclear, cheering and going nuts. And like, when college basketball games are played at Climate Pledge Arena, like, you don't feel that. I went to Gonzaga versus Alabama at Climate Pledge Arena. It was awesome. That arena is fantastic. It was loud. It was booming. It was Zags centric. It was fun, but it's different. And again, not every single game needs to be played at home. I think some neutral site games are good. As a Gonzaga fan who lives on the west side, I live in Oregon now, but when I lived in Seattle, it was so great when they would come there. I'm probably going to go to both games in Seattle this year. Like, I don't think it's a bad thing necessarily, but college basketball is better when big games are played at their home arenas. And I'm happy to see Gonzaga make a deal with San Diego State to do just that. And I'm happy to see teams like North Carolina and Kansas choose to do that as well, because when teams like these set the precedent, hopefully it starts to enact some change and we start to see more games like this going forward. And we continue to see teams get a chance to play in front of their students, because that at its fundamental core is what I think college basketball is about. That's going to wrap us up for today here. We got conference realignment all episode long. On Friday, we'll talk about what Colorado to the Big 12 means for Gonzaga, what it means for the Pac-12, what it might mean for UConn. All sorts of good conversation coming your way to close out the week right here on the Locked On Zags podcast, available wherever you get your podcasts and available on YouTube as well. Go hit that subscribe button if you have not done so yet. For now, hang in there, talk all sorts of conference realignment on Friday. And until next time, go Zags.